During a tense high-stakes live interview, Piers Morgan was ready for battle. He came armed with facts, criticisms, and tough questions, intent on challenging and cornering Ibrahim Traore, the young, bold leader of Burkina Faso's transitional government. But what no one expected was this: Traore didn't meet confrontation with fire. He met it with calm, with conviction, and with one heartfelt sentence that silenced the room. The audience fell into stunned silence. Piers was left speechless. Viewers around the world were moved, many to tears, by the quiet force of his truth. The studio lights were bright. Cameras warmed up. Piers sat at his desk, flipping through notes, his signature scowl locked in. He thrived on tension, on conflict. He was in his element. His guest tonight was Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier-turned-statesman, now leading a turbulent nation through change. Young, defiant, a man some hailed as a hero, others condemned as reckless. This wasn't going to be a cordial exchange. The red camera lights blinked on. 3, 2, 1, the producer counted down. Tonight, Piers began, his voice sharp. We're joined by a man who's become one of the most controversial figures on the global stage. Some call him a symbol of African resilience. Others say he's dangerous and impulsive. President Ibrahim Traoré, welcome. Traoré nodded gently. He didn't smile. That calm, unshaken demeanor, so often misunderstood, held steady. Piers leaned in, not wasting a second. You've made decisions that have cost lives, he said. You've pushed out foreign forces, broken with traditional allies. Some say you're playing with fire. Do you feel no guilt at all? Or do you just hide it well? The studio air thickened. Traoré didn't blink. He looked straight at Piers and said softly, "Do you really want to know?" Even Piers paused, caught off guard by the quiet gravity in the question. People at home leaned closer to their screens. The silence stretched. Finally, Piers cleared his throat and said, "Yes, I want to know." "Don't tell me you have no regrets, Mr. President. Everyone does." Traoré folded his hands calmly on the desk. "My regret," he began, his voice even, "is not what you think it is." Piers raised an eyebrow, eyes narrowed, waiting. Traoré looked not angry, not defiant, just human. "My regret," he said again, this time with a tremor in his voice, "is that there are still children who look at me like I failed to protect them." The entire studio went still. Piers had no words. Social media clips of the moment began circulating instantly. "Children," Traoré continued, "who see me not as a leader, but as someone who let them down." It was the first time Piers's expression softened. Traoré, now visibly emotional, continued, "I see their faces every night, in refugee camps, on war-torn streets, children with hollow eyes asking why we let this happen to them. And I have no answer, at least not one that's good enough." In the control room, even the crew was silent. The fire that normally blazed behind Piers's sharp questions flickered. He looked at Traoré differently now. How do you carry that?" Piers finally asked, voice low. Traoré closed his eyes briefly, opened them again, wet but focused. "Because if I don't," he said, "who will?" The words echoed across the airwaves. Off-camera, Candace Owens, invited as a guest analyst, was caught in a close-up, visibly emotional. She bit her lip and spoke into her mic, barely audible. "I've never heard anything like this before." Millions watching agreed. The interview rolled on, but the tone had shifted. Piers leaned forward, regaining some of his fire. "You speak of sacrifice," he said, "but Burkina Faso's economy is in crisis. You've expelled foreign troops, cut ties with global powers. Many say you've isolated your country and doomed your people just to make a political point. Is this really about them, or about your pride?" The question was pointed, aggressive. The room tensed. Even Traoré's translator shifted nervously. But Traoré didn't waver. He stared directly at Piers. Then he said in a quiet voice that sliced through the tension, "Do you think I sleep through the sound of children crying?" The words hit like a punch to the chest. Piers stopped mid-breath. So did everyone else. Traoré adjusted his jacket slightly, steadying himself. This was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning. "I once stood outside a burned-out school," he began. "Early morning. The air still smelled of smoke. There was a little girl, maybe 6 years old, holding her brother's hand." He paused. The room held its breath. He was already gone. But she didn't know it yet. She kept saying, "He's sleeping. He's just sleeping." Another silence. She looked up at me. He continued, his voice cracking. "Hunt asked if I could wake him up. And I couldn't. I couldn't. A gasp escaped from someone in the studio. But no one interrupted. I carry her eyes with me every day, Traore said. I carry every child's question that I haven't yet been able to answer. That's why I keep fighting. Piers didn't respond. The questions, the notes, the usual rhythm of the show, they no longer mattered. This wasn't just a political interview. It was a portrait of what leadership can cost, of what it means to carry a nation's grief, and refuse to run from it. Not out of ego, but because I refuse to face another little girl begging me to wake her brother. Piers Morgan's expression softened just a fraction. His pen came to rest, motionless on the desk. No one, not even him, had anticipated this moment. For the first time in his career, Piers was speechless. The words stuck in his throat. He glanced at Traore, then down at his own notes, which suddenly seemed trivial and insignificant. The cameras continued rolling as Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly, gaze unwavering, hands calmly folded, waiting. The audience was silent, except for quiet tears. People wiped their eyes, unable to look away. On social media, clips of that single sentence. "Do you think I sleep through the sound of children crying?" were already going viral. Comments flooded in hearts, crying emojis, and messages like, "This man is a true leader. I never knew his story before. Now I can't stop crying." Even Piers, known for his composure, had to clear his throat before speaking again. When he did, his voice was softer, almost fragile. "How do you keep going?" he asked. "When the weight of it all must feel unbearable." Traore met his gaze with a faint, wary smile. What he said next shattered everyone watching. Piers pressed on. "Sharper now. If the cost is so high, why not step aside? Why put yourself, and your people, through all this pain?" The question hung heavily. The camera zoomed in on Traore. He was silent so long the audience shifted uneasily. Even colleagues frowned, expecting him to deflect or dodge. Finally, Traore exhaled and said quietly, "Because my people never got to step aside." The room fell silent. When terrorists stormed their homes, they had no choice. When their fields burned, they had no choice. When their children starved, they had no choice. "So why should I?" Murmurs spread through the audience. A woman in the front row covered her mouth, tears already falling. Even Piers were quiet. Traore's calm voice made the weight even heavier. The studio lights seemed to dim. The only sound was the soft breathing of those present. Viewers at home reached for tissues. As the cameras rolled, Traore reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This," he said, holding it up, "is why I don't quit." The audience leaned in. Piers leaned forward. "It's from a mother," Traore explained. "A woman I met last month after her son died defending his village." He unfolded the letter carefully, steady despite the burden of his words. She wrote. He read aloud. "President Traore, if you must fall, fall forward, so that even in your fall, we know someone was fighting for us." He paused, eyes on the paper, then looked back at Piers, voice barely above a whisper. "How do I tell her son that I quit?" Piers swallowed hard. His pen slipped from his fingers onto the desk. For the first time, his usual sharp, combative demeanor softened completely. At home, viewers wiped away tears. Comments flooded in. "I've never cried during an interview before. He's speaking for all of us." Piers cleared his throat, voice cracking despite his effort. "You speak of children, of mothers, of sacrifice. But what about you, Mr. Traore? What have you sacrificed?" The question seemed to catch Traore off guard for a moment. His eyes dropped to the floor. When he looked back, something in his expression had shifted. "I've sacrificed myself," he said simply. The words landed like a blow. "My family rarely sees me. My mother fears for my life every day. I've lost friends, lost sleep. Sometimes I think I've even lost myself." A tear shimmered in his eyes, but he didn't look away. The studio audience was breathless. Piers leaned back, visibly shaken. His lips trembled as he whispered to himself, "I've never heard this before." Those 6 words rang out through the studio like a bell. Even the producers behind the cameras were frozen. Millions of viewers felt their hearts break open. The cameras kept rolling, but no one moved. Even the makeup artist in the corner had stopped, clutching a tissue. Traore's words hung in the air like a prayer. "I've sacrificed myself." And then, the silence said more than any words could. Piers looked at him differently now. His usual fire was gone, replaced by something softer, something like respect. He leaned forward and asked gently, "Do you ever regret it?" Traore took a deep breath, shoulders heavy. "I regret that they still suffer," he said. "I regret that I haven't done enough yet, but I cannot regret standing here. Because if I leave, who will they have?" The audience wiped their eyes again. Even the cameraman's hands trembled. For the first time, no one interrupted. At home, millions clutched their hearts, realizing they were witnessing something far bigger than politics. From the back row, a voice whispered loud enough to be heard, "He's telling the truth." No one knew who said it, but it didn't matter. That single, quiet sentence seemed to break a dam. The audience murmured in agreement, some nodding through tears. Traore's eyes slowly swept over the dimly lit studio, taking in every face in the audience. The tension in the room was thick, almost palpable. In the second row, his gaze settled on a young woman, her cheeks stained with streaks of mascara. She sat silently, head bowed slightly, quietly wiping away tears with the sleeve of her jacket. The grief etched across her features was raw, private, yet undeniably present. She wasn't alone in feeling the weight of the moment, but her quiet sadness stood out like a beacon in the muted crowd. Piers Morgan, seated across from Traore behind the polished interview desk, caught the same scene. The tough, sharp-edged journalist who had spent decades dissecting every guest before him softened in that instant. For the first time during the entire broadcast, he broke character, the host persona that kept his emotions in check and wielded control over the conversation. He turned toward the audience, the microphone capturing the subtle catch in his voice as he asked, "What do you see when you look at him?" The silence was interrupted by a man rising slowly from his seat near the back. His voice trembled with a mixture of reverence and conviction. "I see someone who cares more about strangers than our own politicians care about us," he said, his words breaking like a wave through the hushed room. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd, gaining strength and urgency. Traore remained seated, hands folded calmly in his lap, allowing the voices around him to fill the space. There was no need for him to interrupt. The room itself seemed to speak. One by one, members of the audience found courage to speak. Their voices carried a mixture of admiration and hope. Some called him a hero. Others said he was the hope they had been waiting for in dark times. The sentiment was unanimous and genuine. Meanwhile, Piers sat motionless, his eyes glistening under the harsh studio lights. The usual journalist armor was cracked, his composure wavering as the emotion of the room seeped into him. The moment stretched, the weight of unspoken words pressing down. Then came the final instruction, whispered quietly into Piers's earpiece by the director. "We're out of time. Wrap it up." But Piers didn't move. The usual brisk ending that closed his shows was nowhere in sight. Instead, he stared at Traore for what felt like an eternity, searching for answers in his calm, steady gaze. Finally, Piers's voice cut through the tension. "What would you say if the whole world was listening right now?" The studio held its breath. Cameras zoomed in tightly on Traore's face, capturing every subtle flicker of emotion. His eyes met the lens, unwavering, his voice low but clear, filled with a profound sincerity that commanded attention. "The people you ignore today," he said, "hear the people who will bury your children tomorrow. So choose love. Choose them. Choose humanity before it's too late." The room fell into a heavy silence, so profound it seemed as though even the air itself had stopped moving. A pin dropped somewhere in the back, and it echoed faintly against the walls. Piers blinked rapidly, struggling to find words. The usually composed politicians and commentators present found their throats tight, unable to form a reply. Slowly, one man nodded, an almost defeated gesture, yet charged with a deep sense of respect and recognition. The clip, recorded live, was immediately uploaded and swept across the internet. Within minutes, it was everywhere. The sentence that shook the world, the headlines declared. At home, millions watched through tear-filled eyes, mesmerized by the unflinching honesty they had just witnessed. The world had stopped scrolling. They could not look away. Back in the studio, the harsh lights dimmed as the show wrapped up, but outside, the world was already alight with conversation and change. Traore's calm, piercing words flooded every social media platform: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Hashtags like "Find Not Politics But Truth" and "Fight Traore Speak" shot to the top of every trending list. People from every continent shared the message, reposting and reflecting. "The people you ignore today are the people who will bury your children tomorrow. So choose love. Choose them. Choose humanity before it's too late." In the studio, Piers sat behind his desk, stunned. The man who usually dissected his guests with relentless precision had no words left. He sat silently, staring down at his hands as the hectic activity of producers and crew swirled around him. Phones rang incessantly, urgent whispers floated through the control room. This moment had changed everything. Traoré's story was not just about one man. It was about a movement, a people, and a world on the brink of transformation. Behind his calm exterior was a lifetime of sacrifice and struggle. He had endured more pain than most could imagine, not just personally, but as the representative of a community ravaged by conflict and neglect. The burden he bore was evident in every line on his face, every slow breath he took. The young woman wiping tears in the audience was one of countless others, whose lives had been touched by the tragedies Traoré spoke of. Families torn apart by violence, children who knew hunger as a daily reality, communities displaced by fear and political indifference. Piers, known for his sharp tongue and unyielding style, had for once been disarmed by the raw humanity before him. This was not a political debate or a scripted soundbite. It was a human story, pleading for recognition. When Piers asked, "What do you see when you look at him?" the question reverberated beyond the studio walls. It challenged viewers everywhere to see beyond political divides, to look at the human being in front of them, and ask what it truly meant to lead. The man who rose to answer spoke from the heart, echoing a common frustration: that many politicians seemed distant and indifferent, while Traoré's concern for strangers felt genuine and urgent. As voices joined together, the room transformed. The interview had ceased to be just a broadcast. It had become a gathering of souls searching for hope. When the director's voice crackled in Piers's earpiece, it was a stark reminder of time's limits. But Piers, sensing something larger at stake, pressed forward. His final question, the one that invited Traoré to speak directly to the world, captured the essence of the moment. Traoré's words were a plea and a warning. They cut through political rhetoric and social noise, reminding everyone that ignoring suffering today plants the seeds of future tragedy. The silence that followed his statement was not emptiness but fullness, an overwhelming collective realization. Across the globe, millions paused. In living rooms, cafes, offices, and streets, people heard the message and felt its weight. Social media exploded as clips spread like wildfire. Hashtags trended as people debated, shared, and mourned. But beyond the noise, a quiet resolve began to grow, an urge to choose compassion over apathy, connection over division. Piers, often the master of his domain, found himself humbled. He sat alone in the studio, overwhelmed by the gravity of what had just occurred. Producers and crew worked frantically behind the scenes, but none could break the reverent stillness that hung in the air. This was more than a television moment. It was a call to humanity, one that would echo for years to come. The audience filed out of the studio in near silence, many discreetly wiping away tears. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, grief, hope, and something fragile yet fierce that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. Meanwhile, Traoré slipped quietly through the back door, stepping into the crisp London night. The chill wrapped around him like a shroud, but it did little to dull the warmth growing inside his chest. Already, strangers on the street recognized him. One woman hesitated, then crossed the pavement to clutch his hand gently. Her voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with gratitude. "Thank you. I'll never forget tonight." Traoré offered her a soft, humble smile and continued walking, the weight of her words settling deeply in his heart. He understood now. This was bigger than anything he had imagined. The quiet spark he had ignited was beginning to catch fire. Thousands of miles away, back in Burkina Faso, the streets pulsed with life and celebration. Families gathered around radios and televisions, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of the screen. Clips of their president's words replayed over and over, carrying a message that resonated far beyond politics. People cried openly in the streets, embracing one another with shared pride and relief. Children ran and shouted his name, their laughter ringing through the warm night air.
"He spoke for us!"
they called. He told them the truth. At his modest home in Ouagadougou, Traoré's mother watched the clip on a small, worn television set. Silent tears traced gentle paths down her cheeks as she whispered a prayer for her son's strength and safety. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone and sent him a simple message: "My son, you have carried our pain into the light. Be strong, we are with you." Alone in his London hotel room, Traoré read her words over and over. For the first time that day, the calm mask he wore cracked, pressing his forehead into his hands. He allowed himself to weep quietly, for the lives lost, the mothers still waiting for their sons, the children who would go to sleep hungry tonight. In that moment, doubt crept in. Was it enough? Could his words truly make a difference? But then he stood, wiped his eyes, and steeled himself. Tomorrow the world would still be watching, and he had to be ready. The following morning, dressed and prepared to leave his hotel, Traoré's phone rang. The caller ID displayed Piers Morgan's name. The voice on the other end was different, softer, less guarded. Ibrahim, Piers began hesitantly. I just wanted to say thank you. There was a pause, thick with emotion. You didn't just speak to me last night. Piers continued, his voice cracking slightly. You spoke to everyone, and I'd like you to come back. There are more things the world needs to hear from you. Traoré took a moment before responding. Thank you, Piers, he said gently. I'll come back, but only if you're ready to listen, not just to ask. Silence filled the line before Piers finally answered. I'm ready. After hanging up, Traoré stood by the window, gazing down at the bustling city below. Though the sky was gray and heavy, the streets were alive with motion. People rushing to their destinations, children laughing in the distance, strangers brushing past one another in the flow of everyday life. And for the first time in a long while, hope stirred inside him, not just for himself, but for all of them. That evening, Traoré returned to the studio for a follow-up segment, ready to continue speaking truths the world needed to hear. Outside, a crowd had already gathered, standing patiently in the rain just to catch a glimpse of him. Some held handmade signs, simple but powerful messages that fluttered in the damp breeze. You speak for us, truth still matters. Thank you, Ibrahim. The faces around him were a mix of hope, gratitude, and quiet determination. This time, Piers met Traoré at the studio door, not as the sharp-tongued challenger from before, but almost as a friend. His eyes were heavy with fatigue, but beneath that wariness there was something softer, more vulnerable. As they walked down the corridor toward the studio lights, the hum of anticipation from the waiting audience filled the air. Traoré glanced at the bright cameras, the shining stage, the expectant faces. He understood the gravity of the moment. What he was about to say wasn't just for tonight. It would ripple far beyond these walls, long after the cameras stopped rolling. Pausing at the door, he took a deep breath. In his mind, the faces of his people came into focus. Farmers bent over cracked, dry earth, children with wide, hungry eyes, mothers holding their breath, waiting for sons who might never return from war. The door swung open, and as he stepped into the blinding studio lights, the room fell into a reverent silence. This wasn't just another interview. This was a reckoning. The segment began. Piers leaned forward, voice trembling just slightly as he spoke. You spoke last time about humanity, but tell me, Mr. Traoré, why does it matter if the world listens? People don't change. The room held its breath. The silence was heavy, almost tangible. Traoré's hands rested calmly in his lap. He didn't rush to answer. Finally, he looked directly at Piers. His voice steady but soft. Because even if they don't change, you can. Piers froze, mouth slightly agape. The words landed like stones sinking into deep water. Slow, profound, impossible to ignore. A quiet gasp escaped from somewhere in the audience. A young woman wiped tears from her cheek. Traoré continued. Change doesn't start with the world. It starts with you, one heart at a time. The silence that followed was deafening. Piers lowered his gaze, speechless. Across the globe, millions of viewers, watching from their kitchens, scrolling on their phones, sitting in their living rooms, sat frozen, tears streaming down their faces, hands clutching their chests. In that moment, politics faded away. Humanity stood bare and undeniable. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, the applause didn't. People rose to their feet, many weeping openly. Some reached out, just to touch his hand, a gesture of thanks and solidarity. Piers approached him, voice breaking. Thank you, Ibrahim. I'll never forget this. Traoré smiled faintly and replied, It's not about me, Piers. It's about what you do next. That night, as he stepped out of the studio, the rain had ceased. The air was fresh, clean and hopeful. The same crowd from earlier was still waiting, cheering softly. Traoré waved to them, heart full. He knew he couldn't fix everything in a day or a week. But he had planted a seed, one that might take root. even in the hardest soil, and maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to nurture it. If this story moved you, touched your heart, or even brought tears to your eyes, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment below sharing the part that touched you most. Let's share this moment of humanity together and keep the conversation alive. Truth over politics.